And we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. A couple years back, when the last Congress was being seated, there was an extremely heated and intense debate on the left about whether the left members of Congress, the Squad, the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and so on, should force a vote on Medicare for all in return for supporting Nancy Pelosi's bid to become Speaker of the House again. Now, you'll recall that the margin in that House majority was rather slim. We've seen what the far right has done with a slim Republican majority this year, forcing 15 votes and all sorts of concessions out of Kevin McCarthy. And that's reignited the whole debate. Should the left have demanded a vote? The idea was first surfaced by my former colleague at the Young Turks. We were both regulars there many years ago. Jimmy Dore, a comedian and podcaster, he was really pushing this force the vote idea. It got very heated. We could go into the personalities. We don't need to, but it got very heated. Let's leave it at that. And it seems now that it's been reignited a bit, that, I saw my friend Ben Burgis was getting drawn into this. And I would say I have a somewhat different viewpoint than Ben, but I don't see any reason to talk about it without getting extremely heated, or even a little heated. So Ben has kindly consented to rejoin us on the Zero Hour. Ben Burgis is a columnist for Jacobin. He is the host of Give Them an Argument, which is a really good podcast you should check out. And he is also an adjunct professor of philosophy. So without any further ado, Ben Burgis, welcome back to the program.
Hey, thanks, Richard.
So basically, this is not going to be one of those fun, well, maybe it will be, but it's superheated arguments as I was setting up. I think that we do differ, though, and I wanted to talk about that a little bit because one of my frustrations, now you also wrote a book called Give Them an Argument. You believe in intelligent, well-ordered, well-structured debate, as do I. And it seems to me that almost from the very beginning, 2 years ago, a number of different issues got mixed up and a number of different emotions got mixed up in the argument around force the vote. So, there's kind of an argument and a meta argument, right? The meta argument being, how should we argue about this? And you got into it a little bit with Jimmy Dore, with Glenn Greenwald, I think Brianna Joy Gray, all of whom have strongly supported the idea of force the vote. I thought there was a good argument for it then. The position there, I didn't feel, I thought there were different ways, different potential strategies, but I thought it was very much a strategy discussion worth having. You don't give the idea much credence. And so I just thought we could get together and maybe talk about, first of all, how we should talk about this. I'm sorry to sound so pedantic, but then secondly, the areas where we differ. We can do them in either way you want, but if I had my way, I would kind of lay out for you, like break down what I think the parts of this argument are all about. May I do that to begin with?
Sure, sounds good.
Okay, so first of all, the question that was seemingly debated in 2020 and has been revived now is, should the left in Congress, in the House, have forced a vote on Medicare for all in return for supporting Nancy Pelosi for Speaker? But I think, particularly as the argument unfolded, I saw these different constituent elements of this disagreement rolling out. Okay, so I just want to briefly list them for you. One is, should the left have demanded something in return for backing Pelosi as Speaker? And should Okay, that's what. And two, should they have engaged in brinksmanship if necessary to back whatever demand they chose? Should it have been? Should it have been Medicare for all? Should that have been the issue? And then could both sides have communicated better about it, including the House left? And that's basically it. Those are, I think, the parts of it. Do you think that's basically right?
In a sense, I think it is, although I would say that I think there's been a lot of slippage about this, especially the 2 years since then, about what people are actually arguing about now versus how people are talking about it in retrospect. I think those were often very different.
Mm-hmm.
At the time, even though some forced the vote proponents, certainly Brown Joy Gray, would sometimes very briefly in passing sort of give a nod to the idea that something else, other demands could be thrown in, as well as a forced vote, as well as a floor vote on Medicare for all. Being real about it, 99.99999% of what forced the vote advocates were saying was laser focused on the issue of a floor vote about Medicare for all.
Sure. No, I understand. Yeah.
That's what the disagreement was really about,
Mm-hmm.
whether that made sense. And I think oftentimes that's sort of conflated in a frustrating way with, well, so how do you feel about the issue of using leverage in general?
Right.
Or should you, should the squad or the Progressive Caucus, which, by the way, we don't want to conflate those. Those are very different entities.
Of course. Yeah.
The squad is tiny. And some of the people in it, are certainly disappointing to me sometimes, but
Mm-hmm.
it's miles to the left of like the sort of median member of the Progressive Caucus as a whole. I think
Right.
he at one point was a member of the Progressive Caucus. I think that means very little, which is not an insignificant point for this debate too, because the squad by itself, even relative to the margins we were talking about, was I don't think was even enough members to unseat Pelosi by themselves.
But I just to jump in for a second, but I would say that's largely, I agree with that. But it was also true that for the 2020 caucus, Pramila Jayapal, and I think wisely, basically, it had been that anybody who wanted to declare themselves a member of that caucus could be. You had people in Congress who were members of both the Blue Dog Democrat coalition and the Progressive Caucus, which was sort of self-canceling. Jayapal, to her credit, imposed more stricter ideological barriers, not terribly strict, but the size of the caucus shrank as a result, and they had a little bit more ideological unity than they had before. And so I think, yeah, you're right, though. I mean, there's one, what should the squad do? What should the CPC, the Congressional Progressive Caucus, do? I think you're right. They're interconnected, but not,
Yeah, the squad represents the far left of the Congressional Progressive Caucus.
Right.
And it's, and so sort of saying, well, the Congressional Progressive Caucus had the numbers, they could have done this or that or the other thing. I mean, this is a pedantic point. This is not the most important part of the discussion. Right. It's worth registering, that like, oftentimes it's a little bit misleading because people would sort of conflate those two entities.
Fair. Mm-hmm.
Here's what because the Congressional Caucus has the numbers to do such and such, like AOC should have done such and such when sort of she and her friends and the so-called squad, it's a name I don't love, but that doesn't matter, did not have those numbers themselves. But so I should say, my own position at the time was that, and we can get into this, and this is our maybe biggest area of disagreement, is that I don't think that I don't think a floor vote on Medicare for all was a good demand. I actually think it would have been sort of neutral at best, like not had any particularly good or bad outcome. And then the worst case scenarios, I actually think it would have been pretty counterproductive. Because and none of this is to say, because I think there are a lot of other issues, as you say, that got tangled up in this. that we can disaggregate. But none of which is to say like, oh, I'm fine. I have like no complaints about them not being more antagonistic to Democratic leadership. I do. In fact, I said in the article I wrote at the time for Jacobin about this that even though I don't think that forcing a floor vote, which is what we were talking about, literally force the vote, even though I don't think that was a good idea, I would have been all in favor of them just not voting for Pelosi, not even as a strategy, but just sort of on principle, just to politically differentiate themselves from her. And in between those two, if they didn't do what I wanted, what my first choice would have been, which is just to say, oh, just don't vote for this person regardless, or they didn't do the floor vote. There are various things, where you could have, you could have done things that were closer to what the Freedom Caucus hardliners actually just did, right? Which is what I want to get to, because I also think part of my frustration with the way this has been brought back up in light of that is that the House Freedom Caucus hardliners, they weren't bargaining for symbolic floor votes that were going to lose badly. They knew better than that. They were bargaining for things like committee assignments, rules changes.
Although they did, put something up about the IRS. It has to be introduced on the floor. They also, arguably more shrewdly than anybody on the left in 2020, they also forced themselves into positions of real power and influence. And I know you agree with that. I think you agree with that.
I do agree with that. But the reason it's worth pointing out is that, okay, so I guess I should say first, because why do I think that the floor vote on Medicare for all would be a bad idea? Right, because I think that's like that's always been the core of it for me.
Right, and then I'll tell you why I think it was a good idea. Yeah. So, okay.
So I think it was a bad idea because there was this idea that I often see people online say that, people wouldn't have dared vote against healthcare in the middle of a pandemic, or if it had been voted down, then all these people who voted it down, would have been primaried, et cetera. And I think, unfortunately, I really wish that we lived in that reality, but I think that's actually delusional. I think that's just radically disconnected from the reality of what 2020 was like. That, as a matter of fact, and especially because people would say things like, "Oh, this will really, really good to put everybody on record, so we know where they stand." And there are people who are on record because they're co-sponsors of Medicare for All, but if there were an actual vote, they wouldn't vote for it because they wouldn't want to enrage the health insurance industry. And I think none of those things are true. None of them make sense if you think about them for 10 seconds and knew anything about what was going on in 2020.
Although I think that's, to be fair, Ben, I think that's a minority viewpoint among people who wanted to push a Medicare for All vote.
I mean, it's Jimmy Dore's viewpoint. Like I can point you to statements where he said every single one of those things that I just said, or he's liked tweets saying every single one of those things that I just said. Sometimes within the last 24 hours, he's liked tweets saying.
Yeah, but Jimmy Dore is not the whole story. He did get it going, but.
He was the single most prominent voice behind it. Now, that doesn't mean that the way he sees all these questions are exactly the same as anything else, but it does also mean that I'm not just picking out somebody from the crowd and like arbitrarily talking about them. Like, it's like, oh, why are you talking about this guy? Is not representative. I'm talking about the single person most associated with it. And I think that, none of those things make sense. That we just had an entire election where the Democratic nomination phase of the election was overwhelmingly dominated by the issue of Medicare for All. Like they did about, as far as I can recall, about 20,000 debates in the Democratic primaries, and every single one of them had at least half an hour of arguing about Medicare for All in it. It was the biggest, most obvious point of differentiation between Bernie and the centrist candidates, many of whom kind of tried to have it both ways in some way. The person who ultimately won the Democratic nomination was the person who was the most openly opposed to it, Joe Biden. He actually said he would veto it if it crossed his desk as president. And by the time, it's not like normally if you introduce something, you pick up some co-sponsors, you still don't necessarily know what everybody thinks by the time the vote happens. But in this case, years of it being such a high profile issue and hundreds of co-sponsors, anybody who wasn't a co-sponsor in January 2021 was not making any secret of their opposition to Medicare for all. And so what would have happened if there had been a floor vote is that it would have been a massive symbolic defeat. It would have been defeated literally 3-1 because the House was about 50-50 Democrats and Republicans, and 50% of the Democrats and 100% of the Republicans were openly opposed to it. It would not have flushed out any fake co-sponsors, as was often suggested at the time, because anybody who was willing to make the symbolic gesture of co-sponsoring, even though they didn't really want it to happen, would have been at least equally willing to make the meaningless gesture of voting for it when everybody knew it was going to go down 3-1 with no drama and no suspense. And I think that the effect of this, at best, would have been 5 minutes on C-SPAN. It wouldn't have really been covered on, certainly not extensively. It might have been mentioned in passing on the cable networks, and it would have had very little effect on anything. At worst, it would have made it much easier to marginalize Medicare for all advocacy, because you say, well, why are you guys still talking about this thing that only got 25% of the votes in a Democratic-controlled Congress? Why aren't you moving on to some sensible thing that might actually happen, like insert some god-awful, watered-down centrist nonsense here? And I never, at least for me, I never heard anybody sort of say anything about what the vote itself would accomplish that struck me as an upside. It seemed like only potential downsides. And I think, this is why I agree actually with what Ryan Grimm said, that, look, if the squad really wanted to have a vote on Medicare for all, they probably wouldn't have had to play brinksmanship. They would have just asked Pelosi and she would have gleefully given it to them, for the sake of embarrassing them, with the vote total. So I don't think this made sense. And I would point out that at the time, you can watch. I played this on the show the night before recording this on Monday night, and that there was you can watch Jimmy Dore, Breonna Joy Gray, Katie Halper, all major force the vote advocates, and there's a range of people I feel different ways about this. This is not about personalities,
Right.
But in a YouTube window with the one outlier who wasn't convinced, who's Matt Stoller, and Matt Stoller saying, well, what I hear it is they are asking for things. And he gives the example of committee assignments, and Dore's response is, you fucking nerd, committee assignments, get out of here with that. They weren't elected for committee assignments. So I find it a little odd to fast forward to January 2023 to see people saying, well, look, the kinds of things that were dismissed as just nonsense in that context, like more representation on committees, rule changes, things like that, as, it's like, no, we need healthcare, not, committee assignments, that's the stuff the House Freedom Caucus was bargaining for. And so I think there's a little bit of, historical revisionism in saying, well, that basically validates force the vote. No, it doesn't. It wasn't force the committee assignments. It was force the vote. And I think that, if you want to say, look, they should have, they should have acted more aggressively to ask for more and, been more willing to take it to the brink, I might even agree with that. I think that's fine. But I also think there's a reason that 99.99% of forced vote advocacy wasn't about that. Because if your goal is to stridently denounce the few very flawed social democrats, the handful of them who've made it to Congress, to stridently denounce those people, to draw a political line between yourself and them, to say, I'm a real leftist, these people are sellouts, then just saying, well, they should have asked for more committee assignments, or here's a rules change they should have asked for, that doesn't really do that. That doesn't have the emotional charge of these people have sold out our primary policy demand, and they aren't going to fight for you to have health care.
So let's first of all, that last point, a couple of these points kind of focus more or less on one personality, and that's Jimmy. And
Brianna Joy Gray very much too.
okay, but let me go through your points one by one. First of all, just you mentioned it as an aside. I'll respond. I think it would have been a massive mistake not to vote for Pelosi at all. I think it's not a good idea because then you've absolutely traded away whatever minimal leverage you may have as a member of her caucus in return for nothing. So I would not, as some statement that will not get any traction anywhere. So I don't support that. Secondly, I don't agree with your interpretation that the presidential primaries were dominated by Medicare for all. And I'll tell you why. Because while there was always debate about it in each of the candidate gatherings, there was always some time spent on it. It was always a proxy for the question of which of these people is most electable. Joe Biden's victory in those primaries had, I would argue, zero to do with his opposition, or very.
I completely agree with that.
Okay, so I wouldn't say that we just went through a primary process where Medicare for all was repudiated. I would say we went through a primary process where in 20 states, a majority of voters in 20 individual states indicated that Democratic primary voters indicated that they supported Medicare for all. So I think Medicare for all won.
Richard, I agree with everything you've said the last 2 minutes. I know I just talked a lot, but since this is an incredibly important point from what I'm saying, can I just really quickly speak to that?
Sure, because I'm just speaking to what I heard you saying before.
Sure. So when I say the primaries were dominated by Medicare for all, I don't mean that that's what voters base their decisions on. What I mean is that out of the policy issues they talked about, that was the one that dominated. That was the one that they spent the most time on. Now, I totally agree with you. This is really important that that's not why people voted for Joe Biden. Exit polling is very clear on that. In every state except South Carolina, I think, while the primaries were still competitive, that Joe Biden won. The exit polls had the majority of voters supporting Medicare, a majority of Democratic voters supporting Medicare for all, and even with like really clear poll language that you want to replace private insurance system with Medicare for all. So there's like no, or people are just misinterpreting it, So, but this is the crucial point that that people who supported Medicare for all still voted for Joe Biden because they weren't prioritizing Medicare for all. They weren't. They liked the idea. So if somebody asked them at a poll, "Hey, how would you like Medicare for all?" They said, "Yeah, sure, I like that." But that's not what they were voting on. And my question would be, well, why not? Why weren't they voting on that? And I agree with you, right, that what they were prioritizing was electability. But here's the point: that I think right now, unfortunately, it's just not true that the average American or even the average Democratic primary voter is mad that we don't have Medicare for all. They like the idea of Medicare for all. They're not mad that we don't have it. The reason they're not mad that we don't have it is that their sense of what's politically possible, of what's real, is that it's just never ever going to happen. This is what Mark Fisher called capitalist realism, the idea that people accept these like horrifically inegalitarian economic arrangements, not because they like it or they think it's good, but just because they think it's etched into the fabric of reality. There's no point. Their people's entire experience of politics is that nothing big and significant like that ever changes for the better. And so
exactly. And Ben, I would say that is exactly the failure of the left we're talking about now. So, I mean, you had said that the main point of differentiation between Biden and Bernie was Medicare for all. But I think we're agreeing it was who can beat Trump. Really, that was the point of it. Now,
the main point of policy differentiation was Medicare for all, but voters weren't voting on that. They were voting based on electability because, again, they don't take Medicare for all seriously enough as something that might happen to punish people for not supporting it, and which is exactly why this idea that if half of the Democrats in the House voted against Medicare for all, which there would be no suspense whatsoever about, this idea that then voters would go out and punish them in primaries, I think is just not connected to real life. That they
That's exactly what I wanted to. This was exactly the pivot I wanted to make in terms of responding to your points, which is I agree with you that, first of all, as you know, the shift in public opinion over the last 10 years around Medicare for All is nothing short of dazzling. The fact that it has so much support now, even if it's, what you might describe as soft support in terms of people's belief that it can actually happen, is phenomenal progress, which is a snowball rolling downhill that was started by, and it's still mostly Bernie and the people that have come after him. So that's a huge piece of progress, and agreed that that's a choice between someone who supports Medicare for All and the person that they think, I'm not sure correctly, was more likely to beat Donald Trump. They chose the person more likely to beat Donald Trump. But here, I want to get to the, I'm sorry, what?
Yeah, I think we agree incorrectly. Biden got lucky because of COVID. Otherwise, Trump probably would have been reelected. So I think the premise was wrong. I actually think Bernie was more electable, but that doesn't matter. The point is that people thought that Biden was more electable.
Right. And let's stick with your the Mark Fisher capitalist realism. People don't think it's possible point, because I think that's exactly, I think the node where we part ways is that, okay, you see the possibility of you say 3-1 defeat. I would say 2-1, probably more. But you see a big defeat for Medicare for All if it had been brought to a vote at the beginning of.
What's the scenario where it would have been 2-1? So you're thinking that a significant number of Democrats who still weren't co-sponsors in January 2023 would have still voted for it?
Yeah, but I do. But again, because all politicians give themselves permission to vote for something they don't think is going to pass if they think it'll float well with their voters. But actually, whether it's 2-1, 3-1, 2.5, the point is this: if the debate had been conducted correctly, if people saw first of all, both our positions are based on absolute hypotheticals, right? They're both, alternate history scenarios. So, we have to accept that. Both of us, I think, want equal ground there. But I believe that if there had been a congressional debate about Medicare for All, a serious debate, that it would have gotten some attention. I don't know if it would have gotten the attention the McCarthy thing has gotten, unless people wanted to sneak into Congress and have demonstrations on the floor, which I would have tried to organize. But still, there would have been. It would have moved. That very process would have moved it further. It wouldn't have ended. It would have been a beginning, not an ending, but it would have moved Medicare for All from that sort of nice, never going to happen to nice, but it's going to take a lot if this thing is ever going to happen, which may seem like a slight incremental shift in public opinion, but could potentially be big.
Yeah. So two things about that. One, I think that the sort of core of my position is that if we agree that the problem is the capitalist realism problem, then I just don't see how it's possible that a 3-1 defeat wouldn't have deepened that problem, that it wouldn't have made the problem worse. Of course it would have. A massive symbolic defeat that this thing can't even get through a Democratic-controlled House. This thing can't even come close enough that you wonder what happens next time to getting through a Democratic-controlled House. Never mind Senate. Never mind, see if Biden, does threat to veto it. Like, I don't see how that would not have severely reinforced the impression that it was never going to happen. So that's one point. The other point is I have to say that there's a slippage that always drove me crazy at the time, in force the vote advocacy between what the vote itself would have done and what doing a lot of other things would have done. And people always say, well, we could have paired the vote with doing X, Y, and Z. And my point is always, okay, just do X, Y, and Z. You don't need the vote to do that. And in fact, the vote would have only detracted from it by making it look hopeless. But yeah, sure, do the protest in the House floor. I actually said that in my Jacobin article at the time. Jimmy Dore is right about the urgency for Medicare for all, but AOC isn't the problem is the title of that. People want to check that out. That they have, I said that do a sit in on the House floor like Democrats have done, years before for gun control. Like everything that people and people would make one of two kinds of suggestions about things that could be paired with. One is things that were, I think, unhelpfully fanciful. So in the article that Brianna Joy Gray wrote for Current Affairs at the time, she said, well, this would be really effective. Remember, keep in mind, she wrote this in December 2020. This is about a vote that hypothetically would have taken place in January 2021. She said in that Current Affairs article that it would have been effective if the floor vote had been accompanied by a general strike. And I just thought at the time, okay, but that's like saying that would have been more effective if it had been paired by an intergalactic spaceship landing on the roof of Congress and the aliens coming out and demanding Medicare for all, because that you might as well be talking about that because we haven't even had a citywide general strike in the United States since the 1930s. And we've never in American history had a nationwide general strike. And while I would lose my mind with joy if one happened, we also have I believe it used to be 6.7. I think now it's down to 6.2% rate of private sector unionization and a very conservative and embattled labor movement. And so there's just no, as you said, we could speculate about what would have happened in alternate timelines. And there's some of this that what seems obvious to me doesn't seem obvious to you, and fair enough. But I mean, I hope one thing we could agree on is that there is no timeline that started the same way our December 2020 did that had a general strike in January 2020.
Oh, no, we can definitely agree with that. And on that, excuse me, Ben Burgis, but this gets to something else that I really wanted to talk to you about, because this doesn't involve our different interpretations of what might have happened had there been a floor vote. And the consistent phrasing I've used about this is that there's a compelling argument in favor of forcing the vote. There are compelling arguments in favor of other militant left strategies within the House, if there are House members willing to do that. But and some of I'm sure many, if not most of them, you and I would agree on. But this gets to, and I think it's worth talking about what I mentioned earlier, this sort of meta argument here. And the reason why I think it's important is because this thing got so heated so fast that, one of the reasons why I largely stayed out of it in 2020, maybe it was cowardice. I don't think so. I think it was just that, I was kind of like, excuse me, I have an observation here. It's like there was no space for nuance, for discussing strategy. I blame Jimmy for, a lot of that. AOC is the worst of the worst. This debate should not be about AOC or her personality, whether she's the best of the best or the worst of the worst, or any other personality. But I also, at the risk of getting in trouble here, because I try to, maintain relationships with some of these people, but I also think a lot of people in the CPC and in the Democratic caucus, and on the Democratic Party left, I was actually shocked by the tone they were taking. And maybe it was, they took, and maybe it was a kind of reflexive response to the attacks or whatever. But what struck me about it, was that they started almost right away sounding, the way that the House left was talking to outside leftists almost mirrored the way House centrists talked to House leftists. Look, well, if you knew what we knew, and we're working on it in private, and, a real left is built on comradeship, and comradeship doesn't mean, no, we're not going to tell you what we're doing. but we're doing stuff. They're saying, and then they came back as well. We got PayGo, which is, we don't. You and I know what that is. I think most of my audience does too. Big deal, actually, not to have to quote unquote have a pay for everything you pass in Congress, and they took credit for that. I don't know if they should or not. I mean, I have a feeling that both Biden and Pelosi are sharp enough to know that they couldn't pass the agenda they wanted in the middle of the pandemic in 2020 with PayGo. So I'm not sure that it wouldn't have gone otherwise. But I will say PayGo was suspended. I would say overall the Democratic caucus voted further left than I expected, but there remain open questions. Could they have gotten more? Was it right to negotiate in private? But to me, I think in the interests of future effectiveness of the left, and right now, just to be clear, I'm not debating you. I'm just saying I'm interested in your opinion. I just think right now for future effectiveness on the left, if we can't, this to me is a strategy issue. It's nothing other than that. It's not a determinant. The fact that you and I disagree doesn't mean that I think one of us is morally superior to the other. That's not what this is about. We have the same goals. We disagree on tactics somewhat. So, on this particular issue. But to me, if we can't have a left that, first of all, has both an inside game in electoral office and an outside activism game, and if we can't have a left inside government and outside government that can debate things like tactics, we're in deep shit.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with everything you just said. I think that, and this is one of the things that I find most frustrated about it, because, as you one of the earliest things you said in the conversation was there are a couple different levels about this. One is the sort of substantive issue. Hey, here's a proposal. Does this make sense or not? I always thought it did not, and I'm happy to give my argument for why it did not. But then there's a different sort of issues like, so, well, what's kind of going on with the way that we're talking about this or arguing about it, and this is part of what got to me about it at the time. I probably should have found my inner RJ and been a little bit more zen at the time.
Is that what I am? Okay.
And what bothered me at the time, and what's really bothered me about the sort of afterlife of Force the Vote in the last 2 years since then, the fact that it sort of constantly brought back up, and anything that like this last week, anything that sort of looks like it if you squint and ignore almost all the details, that is takes, see, we should have done it, they and all you people who said it, go suck on it, we're gonna do a victory lap. It's like the sort of emotional register of it is such that what you'd think we were arguing about was, I don't know, reform or revolution or
right. No, I get it.
War credits for the Kaiser in World War I or not, and what we're actually arguing about is the most inside baseball possible topic in a way, which is because as you say, we're sure, do we need electoral stuff with with people who are driving bars and back rooms, but also big public activist stuff, of course. But the big public activist stuff really has nothing to do with Force the Vote. I mean, if there's and that's one of the frustrating. Well, okay, I want to say something about that in a second, but at first I just want to say, like, what we're actually talking about with Force the Vote is, should some social democrats in Congress have tried this one particular parliamentary maneuver at this one particular time, which is a very, very minor tactical issue. And I think if that had been, which is why I do get a little bit frustrated to say, oh, well, there's this sort of pivot that's not just in this conversation, but I see a lot that's if you sort of try to talk at a broader level about what was going on with the way that Force the Vote played out. It's like, oh, you're just talking about, Jimmy Dore's personality or something like that. It's like, I don't know. I mean, because I think if you think of it as like a campaign, a movement, then, well, what is that campaign directed against? It's not Nancy Pelosi. Right. Nobody was doing Force the Vote, protest, yelling at Nancy Pelosi, is directed against, primarily AOC, because realistically she's the squad member that everybody knows, and she's telegenic and high profile, and and attracts attention. Nobody ever seems to get mad at Rashida Tlaib, but they have but it was directed against the squad itself, and so it never made sense to me. And I'm not saying don't criticize these people; they're politicians. I mean, politicians are often going to, the best politicians are often going to disappoint you. They're responsive to different pressures from different quarters, from the activist base, from leadership, from people in their own constituencies, which is one of the reasons, by the way, I think this Freedom Caucus stuff is so different because they have so much more institutional and grassroots support.
Sure.
But they have
That's true. Yeah.
but yeah, politicians, are facing different incentives and different problems. They're often going to disappoint. You often need a movement to push them in better directions. But so I have no problem with criticizing them when criticism is merited. I've done that recently about certain kinds of identity politics things, about things related to Ukraine war funding. But this particular criticism, to sort of treat this as like a major sort of here's something really bad about them,
Right.
which is what it seems to me that all of this discourse was doing, when what's really bad is not trying this particular parliamentary maneuver that, for all the reasons I said earlier, I don't even think made sense. I actually think it would have been counterproductive. But let's say, for the sake of argument, I'm wrong and you're right about that. Okay, fair enough, right? But even so, even if it was a good idea, right? Not trying this particular parliamentary tactic in January 2021, that is a very inside baseball disagreement going on within a sort of general social democratic electoral strategy, and it doesn't really make sense to see it as a political dividing line the way that it is. I mean, this is. I mean, there's something that's fundamentally crazy to me about the fact. I guess I'm part of the problem because here I am talking about it. I will point out that I'm not the one who brought it back up, but they have a just to be petty about it. But it's like there is something that's crazy to me about the fact that it's 2 years later, and there's still this big argument about whether the this particular parliamentary tactic should have been tried, you know, 2 years ago. That doesn't strike me as a symptom of anything healthy.
See, I also think that, and by the way, and this is where I'm going to lose support from anybody on any side of this argument right now. Well, while the debate was going on, I didn't write it up, and I really should have. If they wanted to force the vote on something, nearly the entire Democratic Party caucus in the House co-sponsored John Larson's bill to expand Social Security. So, okay, force a vote, and Pelosi wouldn't bring it to the floor, and Larson kept saying privately and publicly, Richie Neal's helping me on this, but I kind of doubt Richie Neal was helping him on this. Whatever. I mean, I like Larson, but you want to force something, force expanding Social Security, wildly popular, and, good chance of actually passing, because even some Republicans might feel compelled to vote for it. So they didn't do that. So, the people who...
Or at least it would have been new information that the ones who were against it were against it. I also think, by the way, in not quite where I am, but very close to where I am in California, there have been attempts to pass a sort of state level version of Medicare for all. It wouldn't exactly the same as what you could do on a federal level, but that has been shrewdly blocked from progressing to a vote by Democratic leadership there. And I think forcing a vote on healthcare would actually, if it were possible, I think that would actually make sense, because it's completely different. It's a completely different tactical situation, because it's not 50-50 with Democrats and Republicans. It's
Right.
It's a state where local opinion is well to the left in a lot of ways. There's nobody was California state legislators didn't spend the last year like being asked to take firm positions on this one way or the other. So like there might have actually been Democratic legislators who were sort of willing to who would be nervous about going on record as being against it. And under those circumstances, yeah, great, do it, right? I think, and I think that the Social Security thing, for exactly the same reason, I think that would have made sense, But I think that if you, like, let's say we rolled back time to December 2020, and all the force to vote energy was about force to vote on Social Security, then I would have been on the side of saying, yeah, let's do it. But I still don't think I would have been on the side of saying, look at these, look at these sellouts who aren't doing it, because I would still see it as like a relatively small tactical issue that, like, the reason,
Right.
And this is I guess the last thing I'd say before throwing back. I just, one thing that I get frustrated about here is that there's all this sort of moralizing of a very small number of individual representatives, based on this very small tactical calculation. When the real problem is just that we have an incredibly weak left, that we don't have. Like, what's the maximum number of successful primary campaigns that anything you could call roughly the Bernie left can engineer in a given cycle? Not very many. We have a largely disorganized working class, so even if by some miracle we got to a point where the squad had like 150 members, and there were, I don't know, another 60 or 70 who were like ambiguous but could maybe be pressured to cast a vote for Medicare for all. Even in those circumstances, I don't know that it would become a reality without there being a much more organized working class, because you just need a counterweight to the incredible pressure that would be exerted by the health insurance industry, by Democratic leadership, by Republicans, et cetera. And so I think, it's just a much more, I would love to have a political atmosphere where people, like, where congressmen were actually really worried, oh, I'm gonna be reaping the whirlwind if I don't come out and support for Medicare for all. But I mean, that's just a much bigger project, and it's slow, and it's not sexy because it's about, sort of long-term organizing. But that's what I worry is getting obfuscated in this debate.
And too many people on the left, I think, Ben, are veterans of the sort of 20th century, post 20th century Democratic Party culture. And it's a culture of idealizing celebrity politicians. I used to call it the XFK factor. You had JFK, you had RFK. Who's going to be the next hero? And I mean, I was employee number 5 on Bernie's first campaign, but it's like, he always said, it ain't about me. He always used to say it, and he was right. It ain't about him, and it ain't about AOC, and it ain't about any of these people. And I guess, as a closing thought, for some reason, what kept popping through my head as we were talking about this, did you ever see the TV series Riley, Ace of Spies?
Yeah.
By any chance? It was on PBS like years ago with famous British actor playing this real life, very fictionalized version of this real life guy who spied for the Russians during the Russo-Japanese War, and these different people. And he's spying, and he did spy in post-revolutionary Soviet Union. And there's a scene in it where Lenin is walking to his office building, and a young woman walks up to him and says, I forget who he was negotiating with. I mean, I guess the Kerenskyites were gone, but somebody they did. And she says, why are you doing that? And he says, sister, I would negotiate with the devil himself for the success of our revolution. At which point she pulls out a gun and shoots him in the head. So it's, what's her name? The woman who shot Lenin. But I've always thought, I'm not a Leninist per se, but I've always thought he was kind of on the right track, that, if a deal with Nancy Pelosi would get us Medicare for all when she was speaker, I'd be all for cutting the deal with her. And if AOC or, even somebody I'm closer to and really like Ilhan Omar or somebody like that made a tactical error, I'd be like, you know what? Okay, let's try a different thing next time. I mean, we get so emotionally invested in these personalities and not in outcomes, which I think is another way of saying what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my friend Jason Miles will do a thing when people start talking about AOC where he'll say, okay, so who's your congressman? And oftentimes they don't know because you can be very plugged in to to sort of national level political media and literally not have that information. And I think that I mean I think AOC is sometimes frustrating. I think that I think that people make a mistake actually in sort of equating the squad with Bernie, even though they are roughly politically aligned, because Bernie Sanders actually comes from a socialist tradition.
Right. That's true. Yeah. And whereas AOC, for example, I think she worked in Kennedy's office or something, Teddy Kennedy's office or whatever, which, doesn't mean she can't, be a really good, effective politician. But you're right. Bernie knows the culture, the history, the ideology, in a way that I don't believe any of the others do. I mean, maybe Pete Buttigieg does because his father was a Marxist professor, but he ain't using it if he does.
Was babysat as a kid by Cornel West, apparently, which is hilarious.
Didn't take.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, but yeah, like these other people are just like progressive Democrats who like some of what Bernie was saying. But I think they are very different, and I think that like the political instincts are much more of a mixed bag. And I do hear what you're saying about some of the some of the exchanges where people force the vote people would yell at AOC on Twitter and she would yell back in really unhelpful ways. I think there's also something. I also think that if we ever had a successful whatever the American equivalent would be, given our bizarre election system and having to run the Democratic ballot line or whatever. But if we ever had whatever the American equivalent would be of like a real mass socialist party, I think it would have to have, as a matter of internal discipline, it would have to force all of its elected representatives to turn over their Twitter accounts when they were.
Well, I also have, like AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, you have somebody to call if you want to drink. I have somebody to talk to if I'm like, I got into it over the Twitter files and having Matt Taibbi on the show. If I start to get really pissed off in a Twitter exchange, it's like, hello, tell me to stop. And I will, I'll like, okay, I'm not doing this. And I'll say it, I'll post it. I'll say, I'm not.
Which I should also say, I mean, I think there's a little bit, going back to some of what we were saying a minute ago, there's something a little bit funny about the way that people perceive this stuff, right? Because I'm sure as we're talking about this, anybody who ends up watching who, I mean, if people, I don't know, they like, they like, the Majority Report as opposed to
right.
Whatever Jimmy Dore's show is called. They like they have a relatively more charitable view of AOC or whatever. Then they'll be like nodding along with a lot of what I said, and a lot of people who are on the other end of that, think, oh, shit, this guy's just a lib, he's a whatever.
Right.
Because that's how it's perceived, because it's perceived as a litmus test of that stuff. But I would point out, that like, I mean, you mentioned the Twitter files reminded me of this. Like, there are a lot of other contexts where what I have to say would get exactly the opposite reactions. That I have. I mean, whatever. I think I've mixed feelings about some of Matt Taibbi's output in the last couple of years. I like Tay Inc a lot, but I have but I think But I actually do think the Twitter files were newsworthy, and like there's a lot there that's really important. I think that I have. I'm a lot more worried than some people are in the first group that I just mentioned about the possibility of World War III
Yeah,
over
me too.
Ukraine.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Written a lot about that. Censorship, etc. Like I think there's a range of issues where I would align more with those other people, and the only reason I'm bringing that up is just to sort of maybe urge people, whether all that stuff that I just said, makes people like me more or less, depending on how they feel about all those issues, right? I would maybe just kind of urge people to sort of stop thinking of these as like markers of like what kind of leftist you are, and just start thinking more about like the underlying issue. It's like, okay, look, forget for a second whether whatever like Sam and think that Jimmy's a wrecker, or you like Jimmy and think that Sam's a sellout or whatever. Forget all that, right? Put all that to one side. Just think like, does this make sense?
Does it make sense? And by the way, if someone doesn't agree with you on the left, be a persuader. You're not going to persuade anybody by telling them, by insulting them. If they're already close to your ideology, make your case. Maybe they'll buy it, maybe they won't. But it's a lot more productive than trolling them on social media or whatever.
Yeah, which is like always part of what was at stake for me in this is this question of like identifying friends and enemies. I think that you can have to have. I think you have to be able to sort of differentiate. Okay, who is basically a political ally? I don't agree with them about everything, but they're basically a political ally. Who's an enemy, and if sometimes they're if sometimes they for their own weird reasons they like cross the event horizon and they agree with me about something, then that's great. I'll negotiate.
Right.
But like I have like you just said about Lenin, but I'm not going to get confused into thinking they're on my side. Who's somewhere in between there, and I think that it is really important because I have to say, like, I do sometimes see people who are like very mad at the squad for not forcing the vote and whatever. Like I gave my case earlier about why I disagree with that position, but let's say that's correct. But then like some of these same people will be like, oh, look, the House Freedom Caucus people just negotiated this across the board budget cut that would mean the Pentagon budget could get a cut a little bit too. So actually they're anti-war, so they're kind of good, and it's like that to me is worried because that's a departure from like I think that's a real loss of a sense of perspective that they think, okay, look, the squad, they're politicians, they're flawed, you should take what they do case by case, but they are about as close in terms of policy preferences to what we want as anybody who's in Congress is right now, which is a pretty low bar, but they do clear it. Like regular Democrats are a lot worse than that. But also I think that like, regular Republicans and certainly House Freedom Caucus Republicans are also way worse than that even.
They are. No, I agree. And, it's the binary thinking of they're on my side or they're not on my side, whereas it should be for the sake of the movement and the betterment of society. Are they useful in this context or not? And if not, what can I do about it? I don't need heroes. I just don't. I mean, not living ones. And, I got them, I got as many as I need,
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, you should to lightly I think I mean, look, it's okay to here are the people it's okay to have like get emotionally invested in parasocial relationships with Bernie Sanders, RJ Eskow, and me. Otherwise, don't do it.
Right. And I'm not so sure about you, as they say. But on that note, Ben Burgis, Jacobin columnist, host of Giving Them an Argument, and adjunct philosophy professor, thanks a lot for talking this through with me, and thanks for a great conversation. Thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you.
We'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.